Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Jesse Esparza for a presentation on Jose Joe Campos Torres, a Vietnam veteran whose life was brutally taken from him, and also current efforts to memorialize his life. First, a couple of disclaimers. Tonight's topic is a difficult one. History isn't always stories of progress and achievements, so if tonight's topic is too uncomfortable, we understand and we hope to catch you at a future event. Now, I know Dr. Esparza will present this story as sensitively as he can, but as always, the views and opinions expressed by our guests are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. I'd like to tell you a little bit about our guest. Dr. Esparza is an assistant professor of history in the College of Liberal Arts and Behavioral Sciences at Texas Southern University in Houston, Texas, where he has taught since 2009. He's an expert on the history of Latinos in the United States with an emphasis on civil rights activism. Dr. Esparza's manuscript, Raza Schools, Latino Educational Autonomy and Activism in Texas, 1920 to 1980, which offers a multiracial narrative of a Latino-controlled school district in West Texas between World War I and the Chicano movement, is under consideration with the University of Oklahoma Press. Dr. Esparza teaches Mexican American, Texas, civil rights, and Latin American history. He received his BA and master's degree in history from Southwest Texas State University and a PhD in history from the University of Houston. Welcome, Dr. Esparza.
Greetings. Thank you for having me. I can't thank you enough for this invitation. It is both my privilege and my honor to be tonight's guest speaker. And so thank you, Dr. Zenaida Gould, and thank you also to the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute for their invitation. The title of my lecture is I Can Hate No More, Preserving the History and Memory of Joe Campos Torres. And as Dr. Gould mentioned, it focuses on the wrongful arrest, beating, and murder of a martyr of the Chicano movement, Joe Torres. And it focuses also on the efforts to preserve his history and his memory. I find this lecture interesting because what emerges out of this tragedy would be a sustained effort on the part of activists to end police brutality everywhere throughout Houston and beyond. What happens also is these activists work both independently, but also in conjunction with one another, crossing race lines, class lines, and even generational lines, as we will explore in today's Plática. Now, I'll mention also that much of today's conversation is based off of empirical data found in archival research centers that I'll reference throughout the lecture, and also from publications that have emerged since then. But I want to mention also that much of the conversation is drawn from an interview that I conducted in February of 2020 of Jenny Torres. Jenny Torres is the younger sister of Joe Torres, and she was about 8, 9, or 10 when this tragedy took place. And since then, at the time that she was old enough to do so, she has been his largest advocate, fighting for justice and fighting for awareness on the part of Joe Torres. And so we sat with her, and this was part of a class project for my Mexican American history course that I teach there mostly every spring semester. And we had an opportunity to sit down for about an hour and listen and learn about the tragedy that befell her family. And so Janie was gracious enough to set the record straight in many ways, things that I'll also address later in the conversation. And so much of today's conversation comes from this conversation, this time that we had learning from Janie. And so here is what we learned from this interview. We know that there has been a long history of police brutality in Houston, but the case of police misconduct that would set the city into a frenzy and really forever change it would be the murder of Joe Campos Torres, who on May 5th, 1977, would be arrested, brutally assaulted twice, and then murdered by the Houston Police Department. Joe was a native Houstonian. He grew up in a section of the city called Denver Harbor. This is sort of the east side of the city of Houston, which had and has a high concentration of Mexican Americans. And this is 1973. In 1973, Joe is going to enlist in the U.S. Armed Forces and serves in the Army from 1973 to 1976 at a time when the U.S. is at war in Vietnam. Joe does this despite the fact that Houston had a significant anti-war movement presence. I have a video here of footage of an anti-war march that takes place in Houston in July of 1970. And so Houston had a significant anti-war movement present throughout the entire city. In the summer of 1970, a group of activists who called themselves the Chicano Moratorium Committee Against the War in Vietnam organized a protest march against the war, where over 1,000 people took to the streets of the Second Ward being another section, sort of historic section of town with a sizable Mexican American population. And during this march, activists were protesting the war, walking peacefully, holding signs and banners, flags, white crosses, and a coffin representing those that were killed in the war in Vietnam. And so this was a collective condemnation of the country's involvement in Vietnam. Activists here in July 1970 were also protesting the return of the draft, which was aggressively coming after Chicanos, especially those not enrolled in institutions of higher learning or those that could not prove that they had steady employment. They were drafted in high numbers. The activists who were marching saw the constant bombing of Cambodia and Laos as an expansion of the war, as opposed to reduction of the war. Activists also, they condemned the U.S. For the My Lai massacre, in where American troops, including Mexican Americans, like, for example, Captain Ernest Medina of New Mexico, in where they executed anywhere between 200 to 500 unarmed Vietnamese civilians. And this angered Chicanos vehemently. But the thing that really most galvanized them against the war were their high casualty rates, which was reported to be proportionally higher than any other ethno-racial group involved in this conflict. And so Houston, all that to say is that Houston had a very significant anti-war presence throughout the city, or that is presence alive and well. But despite that, Joe would enlist, and he would serve, as I indicated, between 1973 and 1976. Now, after he is out of the Army, Joe returns home. He finds work and finds employment very, very quickly. He takes up residence with his grandmother to be closer to work. His grandmother lives in the Second Ward. And as we understand it from Janie, life back at home was not too problematic for him. He was a hard worker. He found employment quickly. He was well known throughout the community, and he adjusted back to civilian life, seemingly with little problems. He seemed to be the same brother that we knew, recalls Janie. And so he did not need counseling or therapy or any sort of assistance that, or didn't seem to suffer from PTSD like some of his colleagues would following their exit from the armed services. And so he's back. And then, as I indicated, at the start of May 9th, on May 9th, 1977, at a local bar called the 21 Club, where Joe frequented, and this is according to Janie, where he had gone to several times after work, as he always did, since it was only a few blocks from where his grandmother's house was. And he goes to this bar to drink and to get the day off of him, as you will. But at this location, he gets in an altercation. And so he gets into a bar fight with another client that requires the bar manager, another Mexican American by the name of Antonio Bella, with the B, to intervene by calling the police. Now, the cause of the altercation is wrapped in mystery. Some people say that Joe Torres was a drunk and that he was a mean drunk and that he was there causing a disturbance. Janie, however, sets the record straight and says, no, that is not the case. Joe was a stand-up guy. He was a disciplined guy. And Joe followed rules to the letter, orders, that is, to the letter, and that he was essentially defending himself and defending his property. She goes on to say, people don't understand that Joe had been to that bar numerous times. It was his neighborhood bar, so they knew him. They knew who he was. They knew him by name, and they knew his family, so it made no sense that he would start an altercation there without any good reason, according to Janie. Janie, of course, is referencing statements made by those who claim they knew Joe throughout the investigation that is forthcoming, and who noted that he was a violent alcoholic with a predisposition for menacing violence. And Janie goes on to say this kind of characterization only goes on to demonize him and makes it so others view his assault and then his murder as perhaps deserving. Furthermore, Janie tells us that Joe was an avid lover of music. He loved his music. Joe always had to have his music. He loved music and always was walking around with the boombox, Janie tells us. Well, accordingly, Joe had his boombox with him the night of the altercation. And after coming out of a restroom, he finds his boombox is gone, then discovers that someone in that same location had grabbed it, and he goes to retrieve it, and that this is what triggered the altercation. And so the altercation and the origins of the altercation is wrapped in mystery. I tend to lean towards Janie's interpretation. So the officers are brought in. Antonio Bella, the bar manager, calls in HPD. The first officer to arrive is Officer Oropesa, another Chicano, another Mexican American, because certainly Mexican Americans have been in the Houston Police Department since the 1950s in great numbers, and even prior to the 1950s in smaller numbers. And so Oropesa immediately tries to end the altercation. He has little success. More officers arrive. The other officers that arrive include individuals like Eugene Elliott, who is a rookie on the force, Jerome Schlotnick, Joseph Janis, and Stephen Orlando. They also arrive and they subdue the altercation that is taking place in the 21 Club. Eventually, Joe is subdued and, admittedly still agitated, but he's subdued and he is placed in a patrol vehicle to be transported to a holding cell. Now, why Joe Torres does not remain in the custody of the first officer who arrives on the scene is beyond me and is a mystery and warrants further exploration, right? The question has to be asked, why did Officer Oropesa allow other policemen to take Joe? Why didn't Oropesa take him? I have not been able to find information on Oropesa. I've been not able to find his contact. Otherwise, we would have contacted him and inquired. And so the other arresting officers take possession of Joe and they drive around the city for a while before taking him to the holding cell. While en route to the holding cell, however, one of the patrolmen, Stephen Orlando, takes a short detour and offers to transport Joe into what is known as the Hole. The Hole is the nickname that officers have given to a place where they often take those that they've arrested to teach them a lesson, often a physical one, where they assault people. And so once at the Hole, the arresting officers are joined by several more officers, Terry Wayne Denson, Lewis Kinney, and Glenn Breckmeyer. And then these individuals, these four, then plus three more individuals, commence with assaulting Joe. They beat him up there. They beat him up and they beat him up real bad, is what Janie tells them. After the beating, the arresting officers take Joe to the city jail. But upon arriving and signing him in, because they sign him in the booking, as they say, they were ordered to take him instead, that is to take Joe instead to a hospital. He was too badly beaten. There was a new policy within HPD regarding the mistreatment of prisoners within the department that prevented the officers from booking Joe completely. It was a matter of liability, as many persons had died while under the custody of city police. And so the sergeant on duty looks at Joe and determines that he is too ill and that he might die and that he needs to go to the hospital instead. The sergeant on duty was basically trying to avoid another lawsuit because HPD had several lawsuits resulting from people dying under their custody. And so these officers then have been ordered by their sergeant to send him to one of the local hospitals. But instead, they decide to take Joe back to the Hole and they beat him some more. And as Janie tells it, at that point, Joe was fighting for his life. And the images that you see here are courtesy of LULAC State historian David Contreras, who received those from Judge Lupe Salinas, who worked at Texas Southern University. And these are photos of the investigation that took place during that period. And what you have is you have a bird's eye view of Buffalo Bayou and of the Hole. And then you have close-up shots where those vehicles are parked. That's the place where Joe was assaulted not once but twice. And so they beat him up again. And then after the second beating concluded, the officers are going to force Joe into the bayou, where he ultimately drowns since he was too injured to stay afloat. The fall alone could have killed him since the drop was 17 feet high. And there you can see two images of the drop from the ground level to where the bayou is. That alone could have killed Joe. Now, back at the station, after they drop him in there and leave, back at the station, the officers covered up what they had done, and they told their sergeant that they had let Joe go instead. And seemingly that was the end of that for them. But it wasn't for one of the officers, not for Eugene Elliott. He was the rookie on the force. For him, it was not over. For Eugene Elliott, although he was urged to stay silent, he did not, and he revealed what he witnessed to another relative of his who was also a former, or who was formerly in HPD as well. And so once he did that, sort of the largest cover up in the history of the police department is going to ensue. Now, certainly the following day, and even that night, the family, when Joe did not come home, the family is growing concerned. Uh, Joe's grandmother, who he lives with, is calling Janie and is calling other relatives and other friends to inquire about Joe. It was not like Joe to not let people know where he was or where he was going to be. And it was not like him to not show up without letting people know. And then the next day, he doesn't show up for work, and Joe never missed work, according to Janie. And so when work began to call, that is the people at work, when they began to call, Janie remembers that the family was really, really scared, and they knew that something wasn't right. And so what they did is they reported him missing to HPD, and they arrived to several holding cells. In fact, the one that he was taken to the night previously, where his name was in the book, but his body was not in the cell. And the officers on duty told the family that Joe was not in their custody, even though his name was written in the book. And so after placing the missing persons report, several family members went searching for him everywhere on their own. They went looking for him. They went everywhere, to friends' houses. They went to relatives' houses. They went to hospitals. They went to other drinking establishments. They went everywhere that they can think of going, hoping to find Joe, hoping to run into Joe. And Janie remembers that this was a very sort of tiring and trying time. Then on Mother's Day, exactly 3 days later, since his arrest and beating, the body of Joe would be discovered floating in the bayou, same bayou downstream where he was dropped. To help keep kids calm, Janie remembers that they were taken to a local theater that day for some weekend entertainment. But while at the theaters, this is when Janie remembers that they received the news that a body had been found floating in the bayou. My uncle comes to look for us, she says. He goes in and calls my dad out. Then my dad comes back in and they grab us out, and we're out in the parking lot, and they told us the news, end quote. Immediately, Joe's family is making appointments to visit the morgue. One of his aunts, Dolores Perez, is scheduled a meeting to meet with the morgue there, with the mortician and others, and to try to identify the body, having grown concerned that it might be Joe. The body, however, is too mutilated to be properly identified. Moreover, Joe's wallet was missing as the patrolman removed it from Joe and threw it into the bayou. Certainly, it would sink or float away, and he didn't have identification on him. They had to use fingerprints, and fingerprints ultimately were used to confirm his identity. Joe Torres had been found, and he had been identified. The family was traumatized, to say the least. Everybody was at my grandma's house, Janie recalls. All we could do for the moment was sit and wait. The waiting was torture. Everyone was glued to the TV to catch a glimpse of the news, to see what they were reporting. It shook us. We looked to the news reports and learned that a boater had found him and that the divers brought him out of the water. Learning of how his body was recovered compounded our trauma. We were scared, remembers Janie. We were sitting on the porch, just crying and scared. Now, the medical examiner concluded that Joe died from asphyxia due to drowning and determined that the cause of death was a drowning homicide. Because it was ruled a drowning homicide, HPD is going to respond, and what it does is it suspends 5 officers involved in this incident. Additionally, the Harris County DA gets involved, and it's going to bring charges against those 5 officers, or at least 3 of the 5. Denson and Orlando, for example, were charged with murder, several others with misdemeanor. The chief of police during that time is an individual by the name of Byron Bond. He is going to establish the Internal Affairs Division, or an Internal Affairs Division IAD. And this was a division that was designed to investigate police misconduct. And so Chief Bonds suspends these men and then opens up the Internal Affairs Division. Additionally, the U.S. Department of Justice is going to get involved, as will the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which was already actually investigating HPD on allegations of corruption. The department was already in all kinds of problems legally as a result of police misconduct. Now, it goes without saying that Joe's murder is going to galvanize the Chicano community, which protested against this type of brutality and demanded swift justice. Immediately, the parents of Joe Torres took to the streets, to the courts, and anywhere they could to demand justice. In addition to Joe's parents, there are several activists and organizations that are going to participate in this protest. You'll have, for example, the Mexican American Youth Organization. They would become involved. The Brown Berets would become involved. Organizations specific and unique to Houston, like Barrios Unidos en Defensa, would get involved. And these organizations took to the streets. They organized marches and rallies. They walked throughout the entire city, at City Hall, at several police stations, and things like that. Other groups would get involved as well. Other Main Street middle class groups would be there also, like LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens. They are there also. There is also involvement on the part of politicians, persons like State Representative Ben Reyes, prior to his own problems that he would encounter moving forward. But Ben Reyes is there, who is pushing for the formation of an oversight board led by civilians, among many, many other things. Other middle class groups that would become involved in the protest would be an organization known as the Coalition for Responsible Law Enforcement. There's also the Political Association of Spanish-speaking organizations. Representatives from the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund are there, as are representatives and members of the American GI Forum. They're there also. There would also be the involvement and the participation of socialist-oriented organizations like the Progressive Labor Party. And so all that to say is that there were a slew of activists and organizations that would become involved in this event. And for Janie, their presence was comforting. And as she tells it, it was comforting for her mother, to say the least. We had a lot of activists there, and they gave my mom strength, she tells us in her interview. Now, there will also be major fallout within HPD following Joe's murder. By June of '77, Chief Bond is going to resign, and taking his place is Harry Caldwell, whose first major acting as chief of the Houston Police Department is to terminate the officers involved in Joe's murder. Previously, they were just suspended. Now they are terminated. Shortly thereafter, the Harris County DA is going to indict Patrolman Orlando and Patrolman Denson with murder, while Patrolmans Janish, Kinney, and Brickmeyer receive misdemeanor counts. As for the rookie, Eugene Elliott, he's the one who whistleblew. He's the one who stepped forward and told a relative of his, who then proceeded to tell the brass within HPD. As for the rookie Eugene Elliott, there were no criminal charges filed against him, and he was able to return to duty. He would struggle to remain in the department, and certainly he would be branded a snitch, among many other things, by other fellow officers. As could be expected, once the men were terminated, the 5 men were terminated, and then once they were charged, their community, that is to say the white community and also the blue community, and by blue I mean the police community, would come to the aid of the fired officers. And what they did is they held several fundraising events to ease and to defray the cost of legal matters, right, the court costs and so forth. And so the fired officers would not struggle to pay and cover court fees. Janie Torres and her family would. As preparations for the trial begins, very immediately the attorneys for the officers in question were able to successfully move the location of the trial from Houston to Huntsville. And Huntsville is about an hour to an hour and a half northeast of Houston. And the claim on the part of the defense was that this decision was done to ensure an impartial jury. But for Janie and for Margaret, that's Joe's mom, for Chicanos and for those that protested police brutality, they saw the strategy, and the strategy for them was clear. This was to get an acquittal of officers in question. At the trial, the prosecutorial team found it difficult to convict the police officers since they had to prove intent to commit murder. Moreover, they had to convince an all white jury that white officers were capable of murder. And so, despite a spirited effort, the prosecution fell short of their expectations since they were unable to prove intent. Moreover, an all white jury could not be swayed into seeing Joe as anything other than what the defense had characterized him as, which was a mean alcoholic with a predisposition for violence. According to the defense, Joe was a drunk with a chip on his shoulder who washed out of the military, who had a problem with authority, and who most likely attacked the police officers, forcing them to respond in self defense. The argument was self defense. It worked. It worked like a charm for them. For Janie Torres and her family, the case dragged on, and it began to take a toll on them. Luckily, they had tremendous amount of support from family, from neighbors, from friends, from schools, and so forth. They were solid neighbors, Janie recalls. The schools as well. We had good support at the schools. Janie would get into a lot of fights and be in a lot of trouble during this period. I had a lot of trouble after that, she remembers. I had a lot of anger and I fought a lot, but teachers were very supportive and very understanding. After deliberations, the jury convicted the officers of negligent homicide, and the judge sentenced them to probation with a fine of $1. And so not only was this a failure of justice, it was an insult to the Torres family. It was an insult to victims of police brutality. It was an insult to the Mexican American community. It was an insult to the veteran community. Joe was a veteran himself. And it was an insult to anyone who protested against social injustice. It was horrible. Everybody knew it was so wrong, exclaims Janie. Once news of the decision reached the people, many felt a sense of hopelessness. I felt like we didn't have any rights, that the police could do whatever they wanted and get away with it, recalls a local activist. Others were angered and demanded harsher sentencing. Immediately, activists began to form multiracial and multi-generational coalitions to protest police violence, but to protest also the failure of the courts to prosecute. Again, they marched and they rallied and they protested throughout the streets of Houston, at City Hall, and again in front of the several police stations and so forth. They spoke to media, they held mass meetings, and they distributed literature to galvanize the community. Um, Other groups would join, groups like the Brown Beret, groups like the People's Party 2, which was an offshoot, if you will, of the Black Panther Party. The People's Party 2 of a mostly African American organization. Mayo is back, La Raza Unida is back. You see the involvement of SDS, or Students for a Democratic Society, which was mostly a liberal white organization. They were there. The Progressive Labor Party is back. You have now the involvement of the Revolutionary Communist Party. The Catholic Church is there. It's always been there. You have new organizations that would form and begin to protest the verdict. Justice for Joe Torres Committee is one. The People United to Fight Against Police Brutality is another. And countless others would emerge as a result of this verdict. The Torres family also did their part. My mom spoke at town hall meetings and did whatever she could. At a gathering at Guadalupe Church, hundreds of people carrying signs that read "Killer Cops" and "Racist Cops" came to hear my mom speak. There would be countless of people at these rallies and marches, people of different backgrounds, including Chicanos, African Americans, and young white people, and a lot of Vietnamese as well, remembers Janie. And there was also police officers who were there, and their presence always frightened me. I remember seeing them at the protest, and I remember being scared. By January of the next year, January 78, in the Fifth Circuit Court in Houston, 3 of the 5 officers, that is Janice, Denson, and Orlando, found themselves in a federal court facing 4 indictments. But a few days after deliberation, the judge overseeing that case in January issued a lenient sentence for all 3 men that was nearly identical to the sentencing from the previous case. From the previous case, the gentleman received a 1-year prison term and a $1 fine. That happened in October. And in January through March of 78, under the federal judge extended the 1 year prison term to include 1 day. So it was a 1 year prison term plus 1 day that was added to their sentencing. And so this was another failure of justice. Here again, Mexican Americans, African Americans, liberal whites, and so forth, and these coalition groups saw another miscarriage of justice. And you'll have more protests. The protest begins to grow. Barrios Unidos en Defensa is mounting a movement. The People United to Fight Against Police Brutality. You'll have new coalitions that take shape, like the Stop Killer Cops Coalition and the Congress of African Peoples. They take to the streets with more protests and more magnanimous than before. And this will continue out through the rest of the year. Then in May of 78, right, the top comes off. Now, in May of 78, almost a year to the date of Joe's initial arrest, beating, and then murder, Mexican Americans were congregating in a local green space in North Houston known as Moody Park. Moody Park was a very sort of popular green space for Mexican Americans, and they frequented it often for cultural celebrations. And so on May 7th, 1978, the very next year, several hundred of these Mexican Americans entered into Moody Park to celebrate one of the largest cultural celebrations in the nation, Cinco de Mayo. Tensions were still high, and obviously activists were still protesting both verdicts, and certainly the relationship between law enforcement and the Chicano community was now more strained than ever before. But the gathering at Moody Park was an opportunity for the Mexican American community to distance itself from the year-long trauma it had been experiencing. And so you'll have about 1,500 people who are at this park, including women, children, and elderly in attendance. Church groups are there, volunteer organizations are there, student clubs are there, local businesses are there, other entrepreneurs are there, anyone that is part of the gig economy is there. They're all present to celebrate, to sell, and so forth. And they were there to celebrate, to forget at least for a moment, and to heal perhaps from the tragedies that had plagued their community. But the celebration doesn't last long, as the arrival and the presence of law enforcement quickly is going to change the mood and attitude of park goers. And so the presence, it seems, of HPD is going to anger the people. And clearly they didn't want the police there while they were engaged in their celebration. And so they booed the cops and they hissed at them and they shouted insults toward them. Admittedly, they did these things. And very quickly, the people were provoked, it seemed, by the mere presence of HPD. Why were they there? People were asking. Are the cops here watching us? People would ask. And so who are they here to arrest? And, and those kinds of things. And so seemingly and allegedly, HPD is at the park and allegedly responding to an altercation among park goers. This is what the police record tells us, is that HPD is responding to an altercation in the park. And so again, there's much speculation and much disagreement with this claim. But the police come in and they're in the park and they begin to grab people. They grab a father and they manhandle him and they throw him into a squad car. And when the community sees this, it just blew up, is what one of the activists quoted to us. Once cops were arresting a few people, others began yelling, "No, you're not taking them. You're going to kill them like the way you killed Torres." And these yells prompted more park goers to begin to chant, "Justice for Joe Torres, Viva Joe Torres, and a Chicano's life is worth more than $1." So the people are agitated. And instead of leaving to pacify the situation, the cops do the opposite and they move in. They form a perimeter around a section of the park where Chicanos and their families were celebrating, but now voicing their disdain for HPD. Then the cops move in wearing riot gear and mayhem sets in. In fear for themselves and for their families, the great majority of those in the park scattered as quickly as they could, and they exit from any place that they are able to out of the park. Others, the more militant and certainly the more angered ones, stayed behind and confronted the police. They had had enough of HPD pushing them around and intimidating them. They were going to let the cops know once and for all that enough is enough. Immediately, very quickly, the protests turned violent and eventually spilled onto the surrounding areas as protesters took to the streets, smashing whatever objects they encountered, like automobiles, businesses, and city property. Shouts of "Kill the pig" could be heard echoing throughout the area. I have footage here uh, of uh, of the Moody Park riot as was filmed in 1978.
On another sweltering summer night, in another confrontation between minorities and police. At Moody Park, Hispanics and police clashed right in front of Channel 2's cameras. And two of our reporters were stabbed. Buildings went up in flames as the riot spread. And just as at TSU, no one has ever adequately explained why.
Now, damages from this incident is going to cost the city millions of dollars. And many people would be left hurt in its wake. At least 15 people would receive medical services for severe injuries. HPD that night arrested at least 28 persons, and many people it seemed were being detained just for being in the park, recalls Gloria Rubach, who was an avid member of SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, and an ally activist of the Mexican American community. From this rebellion, three persons are going to receive charges for instigating a riot. The Houston Police Department would label this a riot. And three Mexican Americans who were protesting police brutality would be charged with instigating a riot. Those including a young man by the name of Travis Morales, a young woman by the name of Mara Youngdahl, and another young man by the name of Thomas Hershey. And these were individuals who were members of the People United to Fight Against Police Brutality. And so they would be charged with instigating a riot. But as before, the people would come to their aid and they would form several coalitions to defend them and to assist them. They would form, for example, the Moody Park 3 Defense Committee. They would also form the Moody Park Barrio Defense Coalition. And they were very effective because in the end, none of the three individuals who were charged with instigating a riot saw prison time. It seems that there was a technicality involving the untested riot law that made it so that prosecuting them was, it was difficult to get charges to stick in many ways. Now, the reaction to Moody Park and the issue of police brutality, certainly the rebellion that was staged as a result of it, is going to split the city. On the one hand, you have those who saw police response that night, that is at Moody Park, as necessary and saw the handling and the arrest and the beatings of people as deserving. On the other hand, however, this was another example of statewide and state-sanctioned violence perpetuated against Chicanos specifically and colored communities in general. For Luis Cano, he remembers that the police were angry and that they had every right to be. That the people were angry and they had every right to be. Joe was a war hero, and then for cops to get no punishment, we were all mad, he continues. Now, also, you can see here in the image that this top image here on the slide, this is a collection of mothers with a sign that reads, and it's somewhat cut out, but you can almost read it. It says, "Morales, stay out." And they're making a reference, they're speaking specifically to Travis Morales, who is, according to some Mexican Americans, too radical and too extreme, and was accused of being an outside agitator. And they wanted him out of the movement in many ways. And so there's a rift in the community. The community already has a rift. It's already a very heterogeneous community. The war in Vietnam is dividing the community in several ways. The issue of police brutality, while it unites the community in many ways, also causes a rift, as is the case here, when Mexican American mothers no longer want Travis Morales and his associates involved in the case or in the situation. Moving forward, city leaders, persons like Ben Reyes, that is not Ben Reyes there in the picture. That is a picture of one of the reverends. But State Representative Ben Reyes is going to do several things that would place HPD under great scrutiny. For starters, he would have more Chicanos elected to city council, and voters are going to respond. And so given the ever-changing racial composition of Houston, it would not be long before city council began to look more representative of the city. Second, Ben Reyes is going to be effective at having created citizen review boards, or CRBs. These are boards that have the power to investigate any incidences of police wrongdoing, and they were staffed, if you will, by civilians, not law enforcement. And so the department's rank and file vehemently opposed the formation of CRBs, but it was out of their hands at this point, as this was something that was coming out of the mayor's office, who seemingly was an ally to Mexican Americans. For his part, Ben Reyes also is going to produce a scathing report on HPD, and it's going to reveal several problems. The most urgent, in addition to police misconduct, was that it was in dire need of new leadership. And so by the start of 1980, it received some, as Harry Caldwell is going to resign. In December of 1979, when the three officers that murdered Joe Torres reported to a minimum security federal prison camp at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama, they were quartered in dormitories instead of jail cells. Additionally, they had access to educational programs, television rooms, tennis and hardball courts, weight rooms, as well as several walking and jogging trails. And so this was a lax reprimand, which not only symbolized a chronic problem within the justice system, but it also told the people that officers, even when found guilty, received the most favorable forms of punishments. Joe Torres would ultimately be interred at the Houston National Cemetery. He was 23 years old at the time of his death, and nearly 300 people attended his services. Because Joe was a veteran, he was buried with full military honors, and today Joe remains a martyr of the Mexican American civil rights movement and an inspiration in the fight for social justice. Now, what transpired in May of 1977 was not an isolated event, but instead a historic pattern of police brutality and a miscarriage of justice. But coming out of this tragedy was a moment of intense coalition building among the people and groups like never seen before. Police misconduct was funny that way. Perhaps more so than other issues, it resulted in unified protests across race lines with greater frequency. It amplified efforts toward coalition building in a city more known for broken alliances across race lines. In Houston, for example, Chicanos and African Americans often participated in their own forms of separate and siloed activism, and even competed against one another for jobs, political positions, recognition from city leaders, so that the relationship between brown and black people was tempestuous at best in many ways. But the issue of police misconduct typically helped erase the lines that separated these communities and allowed them to form some of the most impactful grassroots-based organizations in Houston's history, even though many were short-lived. There would be three different forms of coalitions that would emerge during this period. The first would be coalition building between young militant organizations and older and larger, more established middle-class or mainstream organizations. Groups like the American GI Forum or LULAC, for example, would often work to some degree with other groups like La Raza Unida Party, for example. So that's one form of coalition building. Then you have coalition building that crosses race lines, in where you have African Americans and Chicanos working together, or you have white persons align themselves to the cause. The Students for a Democratic Society, for example, would be involved and would be a tremendous ally. The People's Party, too, would do the same. The African Congress of People would do the same, and so forth. Then you would have a third form of coalition building, and this was among the people and law enforcement. Like Dr. Guadalupe Quintanilla, for example. Dr. Quintanilla, during this period, was a professor at the University of Houston. And for her efforts, she attempted to provide cultural competency to officers of the Houston Police Department. And so she taught them Spanish in many ways. They held these classes where officers would go and, as a requirement, have to go and learn Spanish so that they could communicate more effectively with the people they were policing. Additionally, she also taught cultural values and norms so that officers, again, would not misinterpret what the people were saying to them in many ways. And so so this was an effort on the part of Dr. Quintanilla and others like her to educate officers so as to lessen the altercations and the misunderstandings that take place in the community. I do want to mention that Dr. Quintanilla and those who form these kinds of coalitions oftentimes were criticized and accused of siding with the enemy, and charged them with providing more weapons for police officers to infiltrate the community. And so again, there are signs of division and divisiveness that is emerging within the Mexican American community among this coalition building. While the coalition building is taking place, there's also fallout that is emerging as a result of it. Now, moving forward, since 2015, Janie Torres has led a commemoration march in honor of her brother. It is designed to bring awareness to the issue of police brutality, not just in Houston, but throughout the state and the nation as well. And it's typically held every May between the 5th and the 8th of May. Those are the days which mark the when Joe was murdered and when his body was discovered, and so forth. And so the march route also was worth noting, as it begins at the corner where the 21 Club bar once stood. The bar's no longer there. But then this is the bar where Joe Torres gets into the altercation that prompts the arrival of HPD. And from there, marchers then proceed towards a spot in the second ward known as Guadalupe Plaza, where the people can hear speeches and a few words from those family and friends that attend. It then continues, that is, the procession then continues onto the site of Joe's beating at the Hole, where marchers then toss wreaths into the bayou. Several organizations and activists are always present and always participate in the march. Groups like the Brown Beret, for example, are always there. The march has also attracted a new cadre of activists and civil rights organizations. Groups like Fiel, a pro-immigrant rights group, they're there as well. Since the issue of police misconduct remains steady as ever, so too has the response by its protesters. And so, truth be told, as Janie tells us, anyone can attend the march. The march is open to the public. It's open to anyone who would like to come, support, speak, and listen. This belongs to us. This is for us. This belongs to the people. The march, however, is painful, and Janie could not help but think about Joe being in the water. And yet, as she tells us, it's empowering as well. It provides her the strength that she needs and helps with her healing. And she says, is when she doesn't do anything, that's what brings me down, end quote. And so this is a short film of one of the solidarity marches that I attended in 2018, 2019. And this is the quote from Janie, where she states that her doing this is what gives her the strength, and not doing anything is what often brings her down. And then on June 27th of last year, in the summer of last year, the new Houston police chief, Troy Finner, apologized to the Torres family for Joe's murder and promised a monument to be erected in his memory. And then in January of this year, on the 18th of January, Joe's mother, Margaret, is going to give an interview to the media, to the Houston Chronicle, after decades of not speaking to them. And she reveals that the hate that she felt is perhaps gone from her heart. And so again, this is another sort of step towards healing. And this is sort of where I take the title of today's talk, I Can Hate No More. It comes from this interview that she did with the Houston Chronicle. And so certainly this is a step towards educating the people about this tragic incident. Currently, there are plans are in place to dedicate a plaza, a trail, and a mural honoring Joe. That is the renaming of the Austin Street Plaza to the Joe Campos Torres Plaza, and establish a memorial art project in honor of Joe along the Buffalo Bayou, right there on the downtown trail extension. The unveiling of this plaza, trail, and mural is scheduled to take place this year, April 2nd, 2022. The plaza and the trail will sit along Buffalo Bayou in downtown Houston. The route would lead up to a mural on the back of a building in the center of the Criminal Justice District, where judges, police officers, lawyers, and other city officials can see the mural daily. The plans include a pavilion, a statue, a water feature, sitting areas, a bike path, running trails, and all that, sort of goes. These trails go from the hole to where the body was recovered. A section of the trail would include interpretive graphics and interactive features for visitors to connect and come and learn about the history using their smartphones things of that nature. And so again, they will not only learn about these events, but also about the struggle against social injustice. Now, I wish also to share that there is, contrary to popular belief, that there is a mountain of information available on Joe Torres's murder and the people's response to that. There are, for example, numerous archival records, publications, lectures, and other media forms that detail the events surrounding Joe Torres. There are, for example, several archives and online repositories that merit mentioning. There is, for example, the Houston Metropolitan Research Center. This is a special division of the Houston Public Library, and it's an archive center. And in this archive center, they hold several collections dedicated to Joe Torres. They have, for example, a collection known as called the Moody Park Riot Papers. They also have a collection on civil rights organizations like the People United to Fight Against Police Brutality. They got photos of them. And then they have what they call vertical files on Joe Torres, newspaper clippings, and a lot of other important documents. Those three, plus several other collections related to this topic. And so this is oftentimes the mecca of information for Joe Torres, and is situated in downtown Houston, across from City Hall. There is also the Civil Rights in Black and Brown Oral History Project, which is housed out of Texas Christian University, and which is an online repository for oral histories that has a mountain of interviews that were conducted starting in 2015, 2016, and lasted about maybe a year, year and a half. And so they have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, not thousands of interviews of activists. And searching the link, you can type in names like Joe Torres, and you would find several persons who were interviewed that speak specifically on Joe Torres, persons like Daniel Bustamante or Carlos Calvillo and so forth, and countless others, to name a few. There is also the Houston Chronicle Archives, where you can find stories that were written on this topic at the time of its occurrence, but also present time. Currently, the person, in my estimation, the person to contact there at the Houston Chronicle is staff writer Olivia Tallet. And I probably didn't say the last name right, so I'll spell it. It's Tallet. But she is one of the foremost experts on Joe Torres, having interviewed family members recently and producing several editorials on the subject as it relates to the history and the forthcoming memorial. There is also the David Contreras, who I mentioned earlier, who is the LULAC state historian, who has created a massive online repository of Mexican American history. And as part of that repository, he has a wealth of information dedicated to Joe Torres, a slew of interviews and videos. As you can see here, I took a snapshot of that. There is also countless of newspapers that he has retrieved from several places that he has housed online on this online digital repository. And David Contreras is a friend of MACRI, and perhaps he can share his link. I don't want to speak for him, but perhaps he can share his link so that viewers and listeners can access it as well. And so you have these online repositories and these archival centers that have tons of information on Joe Torres. There are also countless publications that everyone should read. First and foremost is Arnoldo de Leon's Ethnicity in the Sun Belt, Mexican Americans in Houston, published in 1978 by the Center for Mexican American Studies at the University of Houston. And this book here provides an in-depth analysis of Joe Torres. His chapter 11, Moderation and Inclusion, is where he discusses this topic at length. Also worth reading is Dwight Watson's 2005 publication, Race in the Houston Police Department, particularly his fifth chapter, The Storm Clouds of Change, the Death of Joe Campos Torres, and the Emergence of Triracial Politics in Houston. That's worth a read also. There are also several forthcoming publications on this topic. One is an article titled Kill the Pigs, the Case of Joe Torres and the Fight Against Police Brutality in Houston. This is scheduled to appear in 2023 in the 2023 edition of Southern Studies, an interdisciplinary journal of the South. The other is an entry for the Handbook of Texas. This is a digital state encyclopedia developed by the Texas State Historical Association and is one of the most referenced sources by scholars, teachers, and students. Expert historian Dr. Cynthia Orozco has written several entries for this, for the Handbook of Texas. And ultimately, they would have one on Joe Torres as well. Similarly, my colleague, Dr. Stalina Virial, a poet, artist, and essayist, and also assistant professor of creative writing at the University of Houston downtown, has a forthcoming publication titled Wacha, wherein she explores the murder and legacy of Joe Torres in a poem called Luto in Protest. This publication is scheduled to be out in 2023. Currently, there are plans on producing an edited volume on Mexican Americans and police violence. Tentatively, it's titled Brown and Blue, Race, Politics, and Community Policing in Houston, and it plans to examine the varied historical relationships between Mexican Americans and the Houston Police Department. And here again, we can expect to see a chapter detailing the tragic event that befell Joe Torres. There is also a wonderful dissertation on the subject. Dr. Melanie Rodriguez, professor of history, also at the University of Houston downtown, wrote her dissertation while she was attending the University of Texas El Paso on the murder of Joe Torres. It is titled Racial Injustice in Houston, Texas, the Mexican American Mobilization against the police killing of Joe Campos Torres. Her plans are to convert that dissertation into a full manuscript, making it the first book-length project on this topic and tragic event. And so there are certainly other publications that I have not listed. There are more, and there are forthcoming publications. There are also countless lectures on this topic, presentations, lectures, talks, and so forth. In 2013, for example, we hosted a screening on the campus of Texas Southern University where we showed raw footage from the Houston Chronicle, from other, from ABC 13 and so forth, where we showed footage of the Moody Park riots and then had a discussion on the murder of Joe Torres. In the fall of 2016, the Center for Public History at the University of Houston hosted a lecture called Murder on the Bayou. In 2020, I gave a talk titled Holding Them Accountable, Coalition Building and Struggle Against Police Misconduct for a Professional History Association, the Oral History Association. I did so again in 2021 for El Águila, La Serpiente y El Nopal lecture series, sponsored by Museo Guadalupe Aztlán, a Houston-based grassroots museum dedicated to preserving Chicano history. In May of 2021, in collaboration with the Latino Initiatives Advisory Committee of the Houston Holocaust Museum, we invited Janie Torres, along with Professor Dwight Watson, to come and give a lecture and have a discussion surrounding, again, the topic of Joe Torres' murder. Earlier this year, I was honored to be a guest lecturer for the Johnny Mata LULAC Council number 19, where I provided a talk titled Worth More Than a Dollar. Then there's tonight's talk hosted by the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. And in October of this year, myself and other historians, including Dr. Melanie Rodriguez, have been invited to hold a session on the relationship between Chicanos in Houston and law enforcement for another professional historical association, the Western Historical Association in San Antonio. And so here too, we expect to deliver a talk on Joe Torres. Lastly, there is a wonderful podcast titled The Chicano Squad, produced by Frequency Machine and Vox Media, which chronicles the experiences of Chicano detectives within HPD. And there's most of the podcast covers sort of the 1980s to the mid 2000s, but the podcast begins with the events surrounding the murder of Joe Torres, and it is definitely worth listening to, highly educational and highly entertaining. And so all this to say is that there is information out there on Joe Torres. There is information there, and it is growing, as you can see from the 3 previous slides. The next step, however, is to get this information into the classrooms K through 12 and beyond as part of its curriculum. And the need for this is ever more apparent in the K through 12 schools, as currently, as many of you know, the schools are ground zero for the war on academic freedom and free speech. Now, in June of 2021, the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, signed into law House Bill 3979. This is a bill that attempts to control teacher and student speech in schools, and a bill that prohibits important conversations about racism, discrimination, and current events. The Texas legislature is succumbing to the pressure of a small group of donors and political operatives who are leading the efforts across the country to whitewash history and to really place a gag order in many ways on academic freedom and freedom of speech. Leading this charge is the 1776 Project PAC. This is a political entity committed to impacting public education nationwide by targeting schools that teach critical race theory or anything they call critical race theory. This PAC is also working to elect school board members committed to reforming public education by promoting patriotism and pride in American history. On their website, for example, they have a pop-up that asks people to report a school promoting critical race theory with a simple form for the name and school and a contact email. Now, just to be clear, critical race theory is a framework. It is not being taught in the schools. It is what can be used to teach in the schools. It's a framework that is used to really try to explain why there exists racial inequality in our society. I once heard a teacher describe it this way. When we consider the unhoused population in Houston, for example, or in San Antonio, and we look at the racial makeup of these unhoused populations, oftentimes they are Mexican American or African American. And they come all colors and classes, certainly, but oftentimes, proportionally speaking, they are brown or they are black. And so we might create, according to this teacher, as she's explaining it, we might create a narrative that says, well, they're lazy and they don't work hard, and that is why they are homeless. Or we might apply our own morals and say, well, they abuse drugs, and that is why they are homeless. But if we use critical race theory as a framework, we might begin to ask other kinds of questions. We might begin to ask, for example, are there laws or other forms of legislation that disproportionately affect Mexican American home buyers? Or are there laws that disproportionately affect Mexican American leasers or renters? Or if not laws, are there other structural inequalities, like in financing or access to higher education, that negatively impact Mexican Americans, so that might explain why there is such a high number of Mexican American unhoused peoples in Houston or in San Antonio or in Dallas and so forth. And so this is what the framework is designed to do, is to encourage us to ask other questions to try to reach conclusions. And this fight, this anti-CRT movement is strong. They have done several things for their cause. For example, they have established a hotline where persons can report a teacher or a school for teaching quote unquote forbidden ideas. They are offering bounties to anyone who can bring credible accusations against a teacher or a school or even an administrator who is talking about banned ideas. Parents can also now file a civil suit and use the courts against anyone teaching the forbidden ideas. Schools can also discipline its educators. Teachers could be sanctioned, suspended, or even fired. States are also threatening in some cases to withhold funds that have been earmarked for school districts or even universities, or pulling back some of the fund that has been distributed. And so, some are even talking about revoking accreditation, that is, removing accreditation from an institution as a way to try to regulate private institutions or private schools K through 12. And so these are draconian bills that empower parents to occupy a space on the district's website that allows them to use cameras in the classrooms to record and live stream, and that allows them to sit in the classroom to watch teachers and to snitch them out in many ways on social media or Fox News. And so they have weaponized parents against teachers and freedom of thought and freedom of speech. And I say all of that to say that there is plenty of information on Joe Torres and on his tragedy. It's there, and more is needed, and more is coming, more is forthcoming. But also needed, however, is having this story included in curriculum K through 12 and beyond. Thank you. Mil gracias.
Jesse, thank you so much for sharing that presentation, that powerful presentation, providing all of that history and context to what happened to Joe Campos Torres. I grew up in Houston, and I was born after this happened, and yet this is a story that I grew up, I didn't know all these details, but I knew that he had been killed. And for my family, and I suspect for a lot of families, what happened to him and then what happened at Moody Park really impacted our understanding of our relationship with the police.
Yeah.
And this is despite the fact that, as you said, the police department did have Mexican American officers going back for a number of years. And so I'm glad you brought up Dwight Watson's book. I put a link to that in the chat for folks if you're interested in the history of how at least one city integrated its police department and the kind of rocky process of that, because it was not smooth by any means. And I think arguably we could say it's ongoing for us to try to have a trusting relationship for many of us, just because of what happened with folks like Joe Campos Torres. And of course, that happened just a few years after the just extremely gut-wrenching death of Santos Rodriguez in Dallas in 1973. 12-year-old boy shot point blank by a police officer and killed. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. One is from an audience member who has a question about racial profiling. Do you know if it was like the Campos Torres situation that really raised awareness in the community about police racial profiling, or was this in fact something that had been going on for a long time?
Well, in more contemporary times, the racial profiling took sort of center stage when the stop and search policies was initiated by several law enforcement. Mm-hmm. And so that is a term that became sort of, common in people's households and in communities. That practice, however, of stopping and searching somebody was a practice that precedes that time, right? It precedes our contemporary time. And so that has always been a method that existed sort of unofficially in some departments, in where you immediately look at a person and determine that that person might be committing some kind of crime, that they either have drugs on them or that they're somewhere to commit a crime. And that is also sort of historic. The idea that Mexican Americans are dangerous and are to be feared and are prone to criminality. That sort of that's historic, and that sort of has permeated over the decades. But as I understand it, racial profiling becomes very sort of namesake in our current time as a result of the stop and search policies that exist, that they enact.
Got it. Okay, and then just one last question, because I know we're going a little bit late, but that's okay. This is very interesting, and that's okay. So when the new Houston police chief made that public apology, I know I was pleasantly surprised, just because I never expected that. But at the same time, I also understand this sense of how is that enough, but I just wanted to ask, do you think that there in Houston, like how was that apology received, and had there been any precedent for something like that before?
I had not heard of something like that had take place before. I know that the relationship prior to Fenner's arrival, there was Art Acevedo who was running the police department, and as I understood it, his relationship with the Torres family was rocky. And oftentimes he would, for as committed as he was, because he made news also as the Black Lives Matter movement erupted in Houston. And he was there, and he was an advocate, and he was a voice, and he was as loud as anybody else and unapologetic that he stood with the people. He has not expressed similar sentiment to Janie Torres and to Margaret Torres and to other members of the Torres family. And so I had not seen anything like that prior. And as I understand it, also, the apology on the part of the new chief was accepted relatively well. In fact, they are working with city council and several organizations and family members to put together, as I mentioned in this Plática, a memorial that is going to honor and really educate and not let the city forget about Joe Torres. And so you have LULAC Council 19, for example, and you have Fiel, for example, and several other organizations, along with Janie and her son and other persons. And so seemingly it looks as though the chief meant what he says. We just have to wait and see if that continues to be the case moving forward. Because admittedly, when I was putting together this research and I was concluding this research for one of the publications that I listed, I mean, Nick Chavez is murdered. Nick Chavez is murdered by the Houston Police Department. And so at the time of the conclusion of, and so it seems like history is repeating itself over and over again. And so it just remains to be seen on whether or not these promises are enduring.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, gente, if you can make it out to Houston on April 2nd, I think it would be wonderful to see a strong showing from the community, both to show the Torres family the support, but also to show HPD that they made a good call in making that apology. And, you know, we can't bring him back, but to acknowledge that terrible mistakes were made is important. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I do want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Especially want to thank Dr. Esparza for bringing forth this very difficult story in a way that I think was informative and educational. We very much appreciate that, and we hope that, you know, eventually we don't have to keep bringing forth new stories like this. If you weren't able to catch all of tonight's talk or you want to share it with others, this will remain online both on our Facebook and YouTube pages. We encourage you to share it with your friends, family, colleagues, or watch it again. I hope you will also consider joining us in a couple of weeks. We're going to have Dr. Tiffany Gonzalez joining us on Tuesday, March 29th, 6 p.m. Central, for a virtual talk titled Changing Representations, Chicanas in the Second Wave Feminist Movement and Texas Politics. Dr. Gonzalez teaches at James Madison University, and we're really excited to have her with us. If you like tonight's presentation, I encourage you to learn more about MACRI and how you can support our vision for a national center dedicated to preserving and disseminating Mexican-American civil rights history by visiting our website at somosmacri.org. Thank you so much and have a great night.